The Esquire's Show Lounge is a big rectangular room attached to a neighborhood bar on the south side of Chicago. The room has chrome luncheonette type tables and chairs with red plastic seats. The customers buy bottles at the bar and get glasses and paper buckets filled with ice and cherries at their tables. There are red lights around the room, faded murals on the wall, and entertainment on the weekend. An MC, a four-piece band, a shake dancer, some amateur talent now and then, and Guitar Red, an albino Negro who gets more out of an electric guitar than any man has a right to. He even plays with his feet. People come from all over Chicago to hear Guitar Red, and on Saturday nights, there were lines around the block. But I was a master of ceremonies and I introduced the acts, and you had to get past me before you could see Guitar Red. I felt it was my show, and I felt like the Esquire Show Lounge was my home and my stadium. All week long, I would train for that Friday night show that started my weekend. For the first time since high school, I got that thirsty taste again, waiting each week to go out and crush the world. Only now, I didn't have to beat anybody. I had to make people happy. Every day during the week, I'd be working out for that 3 day meet, buying comedy records, buying joke books, watching television, listening to people, going to the library and digging into musty old books of humor, and finding out where those comedy records got their material from. I walked downtown and spent money for books and magazines I couldn't even afford. And along the way, I'd hang out at the Walgreens at 63rd and Cottage Grove, and on the corners and anywhere people were, listening to them talk, trying out thoughts and ideas and jokes on strangers. Ozell and William would stay up half the night listening to new routines. And Ira Murchison and Hurt Jubert and Jim Ellis would tell me what they liked and what they thought should go. I'd go to parties and just talk and create and clown, and if something got a good response, I'd mark it down in the back of my mind. Morning, noon, and night, 24 hours a day, trying to develop a mind like I once developed a body, watching, listening, talking. Hours and hours of television, the Ed Sullivan Show, the Jack Parr Show, every comedy show, even funny old movies. And then the news shows, the soap operas, the westerns, the series. What makes people laugh? What are people talking about? And then you watch the stars. How do they act? How do they dress? I went down to Litton's, a big department store on the Loop, and convinced them I was making $100 a week and had been working for 4 years. Ozell and Williams helped me get clothes on credit, new shoes, new suits, new shirts. Change everything between shows. For the regular customers, you're the biggest entertainer they know. You have to look it. Keeping my clothes clean and buying records and books cost me as much as I was making, but I was selling a talent that really wasn't mine yet, and I had to develop it from every angle. I was hung up on something and I had to find out how it worked. Now people were beginning to say, "There goes Dick Gregory again." And it was greater than track ever was because it was all for me. It didn't include the mothers' sons who had to lose so I could win. Between my shows, I talked to people and sit at tables and walk around and shake hands. I met a lot of girls and I started going around with some of them. And I made rules for myself. Never go to a man's table if you think the woman with him is giving you the eye. That man is paying your salary. Not much, but he doesn't know that, and he deserves respect. He has the right to feel comfortable with his lady in the club. Never pick up the money that's thrown on stage. There were nights when there was more money on that stage than I was making in a week, but I never let anyone know I needed that money. I was the big entertainer. Never let a man pay me to introduce him and his party from the floor. If he knew I'd take that kind of money, he couldn't respect me. It's a wild thing about a small nightclub with ordinary working class people. You can get the same kind of respect there that you can get in a big downtown nightclub. You're those people's entertainer, the biggest one they know, probably the biggest they will ever know. The stars on the top have created such an atmosphere of glamour that even the entertainers on the bottom can step in and get that respect. That's why you have to knock yourself out to dress well and act right and keep yourself up. You can never say, look here, I'm just a small time entertainer and my suits don't have to be pressed or my act too sharp or my manners right. Where you are just as big as Milton Berle and Bob Hope and Sammy Davis and Nipsey Russell. You're the big fish in the little, little pond. One Sunday, after my afternoon show, a girl came out of the audience and asked me to come back to her table and give some autographs. She said she'd like me to meet her sisters. I told her I'd be delighted. That's why it's so important to be nice and polite to people. You can never tell when you're going to meet your future wife. I walked over, and there was a young girl at the table, very bashful, very excited. She was twisting her napkin to death and giggling out of embarrassment. When I sat down, it was like God came over to the table. She had never been in a nightclub before. She was from Willard, Ohio, a small town, and her name was Lillian Smith. She was a secretary over at the University of Chicago. You're fooling me, baby. You're really working at the university? No. I mean, yes, I'm not fooling you. Well, look, Lillian, I'm over here nearly every day to run track. Let's have lunch one day. She tucked her head down and started giggling and said, oh no, you don't really mean that. Tell you what, Lillian, give me your phone number. I'll call you and tell you exactly what day we'll have lunch. She was so nervous while she was writing it down. She kept tearing the paper with her pencil point. I rolled up the paper and put it in my pocket. Lillian Smith stayed through the second show and the Sunday evening show and kept staring at me like she was afraid nobody in Willard, Ohio would ever believe she hadn't actually talked to this great man. When I left that night with the girl I was dating at the time, I went over and said goodnight to Lillian. I thought it might give her a thrill to call her, just because she was so sure I wouldn't. That night, back at Ozell and Williams, I lay in bed and thought about the face staring up at me. That soft little girl face, so out of place in a nightclub. It suddenly dawned on me that my mother would have looked that way if she had ever been to a nightclub. I had a dream that night about Mama, and I was Richard again. And she came off the streetcar and ran into the house and said, Richard, oh, Richard, I spoke to the star of the show, Harry Belafonte. I talked to Harry Belafonte. And I said, no, Mama. And she said, yes, I did. I really did. And he's going to call me on the phone. When I woke up that Monday morning, I called Lillian, and I could almost see her expression over the phone. I just talked to her and told her I'd call her back soon and we'd have lunch. That was around the middle of April 1958, and I saw Lillian a few times. She was so bashful and shy. Sometimes I just ran out of words. But I was getting better and better at the Esquire. I worked harder, got to be a night owl, so I can go to the bars and restaurants where other show people hung out when they were finished working. I couldn't afford to watch them work, but I could always buy coffee or a drink and talk to them and listen. I used to walk into those places where nobody knew me, and I used to tell myself that someday I'd walk in there and everybody would turn around and say, hi, Greg. They knew me at the Esquire, though, my crowd. People were beginning to come to see me, not just for Guitar Red or Paul Bascone's band or the Shake Dancer. I'd MC the show and then I'd play bongos with Paul's band, then give my act and MC the show some more, watching the time, keeping things moving like the patrol boy, like the president of the senior class. I'd go out to the show, folks, after work spots, get some sleep, spend the days working on my material, reading, listening, trying my routines on anybody who would sit still. I guess it got to be too much because in the summer, I came down with yellow jaundice. The day I went to the hospital, I called Lillian at her job. She was very concerned and very sweet, even though I hadn't talked to her in more than a month. It was like calling Mama. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks, impatient and angry at missing all those weekends at the Esquire. But it was the first time I ever really slowed down enough to look back down the road. and up ahead. I thought about track and I thought about Doc Lingle and how he used to tell me to take speech and music to prepare for a career in show business. He knew. And that old lady who had seen a star in the middle of my head, she knew too. I was going to go all the way. There were a lot of visitors at the hospital friends, performers, and customers from the Esquire. Girls, a lot of noise, a lot of talking. When the room finally would clear out, there was Lillian, standing shyly in the corner. The first time she came, she brought me candy bars and grapes. You're not supposed to bring these things into a Veterans Administration hospital. But I knew Lillian hadn't sneaked that paper bag past the desk. Some people could just walk into a place and never be stopped and never be questioned. She would stand there, her eyes full of concern, and we hardly talked because she was so shy, and I couldn't always find things to say to her. When visiting hours were over, the first time, she asked if she could come back. I said no. It was too far to come at night. Her eyes seemed to fill up. I explained it wasn't that I didn't want her. It was just such a long trip. She asked me what she could bring the next time. I asked for something to read. When she came back, she brought Life and Time and Newsweek and Look and the Saturday Evening Post and the Reader's Digest, all the magazines I had always wanted to read every week. The magazines I felt I should keep up with but could never afford. She brought me 2 cartons of cigarettes. I had never had 2 cartons at a time. She slipped everything into the drawer, and we tried to hold a conversation for a little while, and then I told her to go before it got too late. After she left, I reached into the drawer for a cigarette. There were 2 rolls of dimes in there for the telephone, and some cigarette money. $100. I counted it 5 times. I couldn't believe it because it was just like Mama would have acted if she were a rich girl like Lillian Smith. When I got out on a 3-day pass from the hospital, I took Lillian to a movie. She was so happy. It was like offering her the world. I went right back to work after I got out of the hospital, and it was like romping and stomping through the neighborhood after the levee and the prom and the Wood River meet and the senior class speech all wrapped into one Friday night where the customers stood and clapped and cheered when I walked back up on the stage. Only they weren't clapping for any gladiator. They weren't clapping for any gladiator. They were saying, "Man, we're really glad you're back. We missed you. Like, how was it?" Did a hell of a show that night, just talking about the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, the other patients. And when it was over, everybody crowded around and told me they were planning to come out and visit me next week. Or they would have sent me a card, but they didn't have the address. And they said it like they meant it. Somebody brought me some flowers. Oh man, I kept romping and stomping all that fall, and my shows got better and better, and the lines got longer and longer, and more people were coming out just to hear me. Lil and I were going out pretty often now, and I'd carry her out to the club to see my act, and then we'd talk about my work, and she'd type up material for me at her job. I was such a big man now. I went right up to the Esquire owners and told them I was due for a raise. Been here almost a year. I'm packing the place every night, and $10 a night just isn't enough for a comic like me. I want $12 a night. They told me $10 a night was plenty. I told them if they didn't give me a $2 raise, I'd quit on them. They didn't give me a raise. When I quit the Esquire, I had the same funny feeling in my stomach. That same funny feeling I had when I left college with nowhere to go. Everything, everyone was behind me. I spent most of December lying around the house, reading and watching television. Toward Christmas, I played a couple benefits just to make me feel like I was still an entertainer. It was at one of those benefit shows that somebody mentioned there was an old vacant nightclub for rent out in Robbins, Illinois. It was owned by a woman named Sally Wells. I called her, and she said their rent was $56 a night. I told her not to make a move until we could get together. Ira Murchison drove me out in his car the next day, a 19-mile trip. And I talked nonstop the whole way. My own nightclub. I could do anything I wanted. I'd be my own boss. I'd do more topical material and less blue material. I'd gain respect as an owner and a performer. I'd develop new talent. I'd pay good salaries. I'd create an atmosphere for good comedy. Everybody would be happy. Ira didn't say a word. He didn't even ask me what I was going to use for money. Sally Wells was a woman in her 70s, and the Apex Club was the most raggedy looking nightclub in the world, a small, dusty, creaky, empty room. It looked a little haunted. We were peeking around the room, the three of us, when Sally Wells suddenly turned to Ira and stared at him with her bright, glittering eyes. You've been overseas, she said mysteriously, and you're going back again. Yeah, that's right. How you know? Said Ira. The year before, he had represented the United States in the Moscow track meet and was planning to go again. Then she turned on me, and I had the same strange feeling I had 20 years before when one of Mama's spiritualist readers said she saw a star in the middle of my head. I see you flying all over this country, from one end to another, with a little brown suitcase in your hand, said Sally Wells. Now I was really impressed. I had always had the idea for some reason that all the top comics carry their material in brown leather briefcases. I also see you getting married soon. Nope, you're wrong there. There's a little matter of having to be in love first. Sally Wells shook her head. I see you getting married. I humored her because I was trying to make a business deal, and then we changed the subject. We sat and talked and figured things out. I'd pay her $168 a week for using the club Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. There was insurance and licenses and cleaning and heat and electricity and water and taxes. By the time Ira and I left Robbins to check back north to Chicago, Dick Gregory was in business. One of the first things I did was borrow $800 from Lillian, my rich ace in the hole. We had gotten pretty close. Then I went to every newspaper in Chicago, white and Negro, and took out ads. In the big papers, good sized ads with printed directions for getting to the Robins cost $65 a day. I was going first class. I bought glasses and tables and chairs, went around to entertainers I knew, and hired a band and some acts. I knew I need a car, and Mary Ann had one. I asked her if she would like to be my head cashier. She was fascinated by the idea. I hired a few other girls I knew, as waitresses. Then I went to buy whiskey. I had never been much of a drinker, but I learned more about liquor in 2 weeks than most people learn in a lifetime. Scotch, bourbon, gin, vodka, rye, wines, brandies, and every kind has a dozen different brands. I finally talked a liquor store owner on 63rd and St. Lawrence into letting me have $1,000 worth of liquor for the first weekend. I would pay for only what was used and opened, bring everything else back. I convinced him that when I hit it big with the club, he'd get all my business. Then all I needed was beer and different kinds of soda. The first Friday in January, I loaded everything into the car and headed out to Robbins. Opening night was only hours away. Halfway out, I realized I had no change. I drove back to town and persuaded Ozell, my landlady, to borrow change from her boss at the drugstore. She had to promise to stand good for $100 worth of silver. Halfway out again, I remember I needed ice for the beer and cubes for the drinks. Back again, out again, then lemons. Then pick up two of the waitresses, one singer, and the girl who owned the car. At 7 o'clock, I opened the doors of the Apex Club and leaned back with a smirky smile to watch the people trample each other in the mad dash to get in. By 9 o'clock, there were four customers. They got very good service. At 10, we had a dozen, mostly friends. By 11, the Apex Club was more than half filled, and baby, I am a nightclub owner. I never worked so hard in my life. Did I ever move that night? One of the acts hasn't shown up. Run out and call them. Introduce the band. A guy comes in without a tie. Hustle him out. Run out of change. Scuffle up some more. Introduce the singer. Need more lemons. Guy without a tie is back. Hustle him out again. Introduce the dancer. Customer isn't satisfied. Go pacify him. Money drawer is stuck. Unstick it. Somebody wants a fancy drink. Go buy a bottle of creme de la menthe. Introduce the guitar player. Glasses are coming out of the kitchen dirty. Send them back and bawl out the waitress. Guy without a tie is back. Go get him one. Two men get up to fight, jump in between them. More change. Customer says he was shortchanged. A lie, but give him money anyway. Go up and do my act. A masterpiece of a show. Another fight. Calm them down and buy them drinks. Drawer stuck. More change. More lemons. More change. More change. Time to close. Carry everybody out. Count the liquor. Count the money. Put the beer back in the cases, cokes back in the cartons, load everything in the car because one robbery here will wipe me out. Drive back to Chicago, too tired to carry everything inside, sleep in the car. Saturday night, we had a big live crowd, a full house. It was twice as wild as Friday night, and I worked 10 times as hard, and it was beautiful. I got up on stage and I gave two great shows, mostly topical material right out of the newspapers. And by the time we closed up, we had $1,200 in the till. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know whether I was opening the club or closing it. I was so tired, but I knew I had $1,200 in a sack. We ran afternoon and evening shows that Sunday to fairly respectable houses. By Monday morning, I was in the pawn shop and at friends' houses, scraping up enough to pay next week's ads and rent. The $1,200 wasn't mine very long, with all the back bills. The only performers I paid for the first weekend were the bandsmen. They belonged to a union that would have closed the place. But I wasn't more than $1,000 in debt now, and things were rolling. And I knew after the second weekend I'd be almost clear. And after that, I'd have to hire someone to help me count the money. I saved that expense at least. The next Friday, we got 13 inches of snow. 13 inches of snow and three customers. I stood in the back of my club that night and I swore that when I really hit it big and went to appear in another man's nightclub, I would refuse to take a penny if the weather was so bad that nobody showed up. I would never take a cent if there was a tornado or a hurricane or a blizzard. I thought about that for a while. I had time that night. Yeah, I thought that's okay when you're thinking as an owner, Greg. But don't forget all those $10 nights at the Esquire when you showed up on bad nights, even when the customers didn't. You were going there to make your rent money, not spend it. Saturday came with 5 more inches of snow and sleet, too. The highways were bad and were 19 miles out of downtown Chicago. 20 people showed up. There were 20 on Sunday and 2 more inches of snow. It was only the beginning of one of the worst winters we ever had in Chicago. The third and fourth weekends had snow and sleet and hail and freezing rain. Most nights there were more employees than customers in the Apex Club. I paid the girls with promises that the weather would break, that we'd hit it big, that they'd get all their back pay and more. They believed me. I borrowed more money to keep the place going. I pawned and sold everything I can get my hands on. I began to resent the bandsman who didn't drink heavily on the job. They were leaving their salaries in the club. The liquor store owner began to complain because I was bringing too much whiskey back. So I began to start each night with a pint of gin, vodka, bourbon, and scotch, 6 cans of beer, and a couple of cartons of soda. As I sold out, I'd run out to a small package store across the street and buy more. There were nights I didn't have to buy more, and the rent went on, and the advertising went on. I was sinking so far into debt I couldn't see straight. On Thursday, January 29th, 1959, I decided it was time to play my ace in the hole again. My rich girl. I went to Lillian Smith. She was sweet but unapologetic. All she could give me was $300. She had to quit her job at the university, and she was leaving town. I had to ask her twice before she told me why. I'm pregnant, Greg. I'm going to have a baby. The words felt as though someone had taken a bucket of ice water and splashed it against my naked guts. That's all I need to know, a baby. Everything I'm trying for, everything I'm killing myself for, and no money and no real home. And I don't want to bring up any baby that's going to be brought up as poor as I was brought up. We sat and we talked, and I asked little questions. No, she wasn't rich. She had saved some money for college. And when she left after a year, she had kept the money in the bank. She had already given most of it to me. Yes, she had known about this for some time. She was about 4 months pregnant. You've been so busy and working so hard, Greg. I just didn't want to. And now I'm not listening to her. And I'm thinking that as poor as the Gregory kids were, and as ornery and as rotten and as no good as Big Prez was, at least we all had a name. Big Prez had given us that. So I asked Lil to marry me. She refused. She said she didn't want to do anything to stand in my way. This time I didn't ask her, I told her. Friday night we got the blood test and I brought the license, and on Monday, February 2nd, I was a married man. Old Lady Wells was right. At midnight on Monday, Lil and I got on the Greyhound bus for St. Louis. 300 miles down, sleeting all the way through the night. I told her that everything would be all right. The weather would break soon, the nightclub would hit, and I'd bring her back to Chicago and be a husband and a father. She was very brave. Lil was going to a city where she knew no one, to live with people she barely knew existed. I had no idea how hard it was going to be for her then. That Tuesday was one of the worst days St. Louis ever had. Rain and snow and driving sleet. The buses weren't running. There were no cabs, and the insurance companies had announced that no cars would be covered that day. We finally found a good bootleg we finally found a guy bootlegging rides, and he took us to the project where my sister Dolores lived with her 3 kids. Dolores was separated from her husband and was working as a waitress. Times were tough for her too, but she was good and kind, and she welcomed Lil. I saw one of my kinfolk in St. Louis and asked everybody to help, and I talked to Lil some more. Then I went back to Chicago and the Apex Club.